Surviving a medieval winter was no easy feat. No central heating, no insulated walls, no thermal underwear. Just you, the biting cold, and whatever you could muster to keep yourself alive. And let's not forget, winters weren't just cold, they were brutal. The so-called Little Ice Age, roughly 1250 to 1850, brought freezing temperatures, harsh storms, and failed crops that often spelled disaster for entire villages. So how did people survive? What kept them from freezing to death in their sleep? Let's step back in time and uncover the medieval secrets of winter survival. The first line of defense against winter's icy grip? A sturdy shelter. But medieval homes weren't exactly cozy cottages with perfect insulation. In fact, they were often drafty, smoky, and barely warm enough to stave off frostbite. Peasant homes were typically built from wattle and daub, a mix of mud, straw, and sticks, or sometimes stone if resources allowed. The roofs? Thatched with straw or reeds, offering some insulation but also a fire hazard waiting to happen. To combat the cold, families relied on basic insulation methods, packing walls with moss, earth, straw, or even animal skins to block out drafts. Some even covered their floors with thick rush mats to trap heat. Now, if you were a wealthy noble or castle dweller, you had slightly better conditions. Thick stone walls retained some heat, and tapestries hanging from walls helped reduce the chill. But castles were massive, and heating them was a nightmare. Fires roared in great halls, but unless you were sitting close, you were probably still shivering. Some nobles even slept with small dogs under their blankets, medieval hot water bottles with fur and an attitude. Speaking of fires, while open hearths provided warmth, they were also a serious risk of suffocation and fire. Many homes lacked proper chimneys, leading to smoke-filled rooms and respiratory issues. And if your house caught fire, well, good luck putting it out in the dead of winter. When the temperature dropped, layers became a medieval person's best friend. Forget fashion. This was about survival. The wealthy wrapped themselves in luxurious fur-lined cloaks, woolen tunics, and thick linen undergarments, while peasants made do with whatever they could afford, often patched up wool and coarse linen, sometimes stuffed with straw for extra warmth. One of the most underrated yet essential items? Woolen stockings and leather boots, crucial for preventing frostbite. And let's not forget the medieval equivalent of gloves, thick mittens made from wool or animal hides. If your fingers went numb, you risked losing them to the cold. And in an age without antibiotics, that could mean the difference between life and death. But winter wasn't just about staying warm, it was about staying dry. Damp clothes meant disaster, so medieval folks waterproofed their garments using animal fat or wax. Peasants also knew a secret: layering greased parchment or oiled linen beneath their clothing to block out the wind and keep their body heat trapped inside. Of course, there was a stark contrast between the rich and the poor. While nobles could afford expensive ermine and sable furs, the average villager had to rely on sheepskin or whatever scraps of fur they could scavenge. And if they didn't have enough? Well, let's just say medieval fashion wasn't always about choice. It was about survival. The fire in the hearth has burned low. The last scraps of salted pork have been gnawed to the bone. A mother, desperate, takes a wooden spoon and scrapes the bottom of a nearly empty grain pot, hoping to gather enough for one more thin porridge. Outside, the wind howls, snowdrifts climb the walls, and the world is silent except for the cries of hungry children. What do you do when the food runs out? In the Middle Ages, this was not a hypothetical scenario, it was an annual test of endurance. For medieval people, winter wasn't something to be enjoyed, it was something to outlast. Everything depended on how well they had prepared in the months before. One mistake, one failed harvest, one lost shipment, one unfortunate fire in the granary, and an entire family, sometimes an entire village, could be doomed. Grain was life. Barley, rye, and oats were dried and stored in tightly sealed granaries, often elevated to keep rodents out. Flour was precious, reserved for black bread, dense, tough loaves that could last for weeks. For the poor, bread was more sawdust than wheat, sometimes mixed with pea flour, acorn meal, or even crushed bark when things got desperate. Meat was a privilege. Pigs were slaughtered in late autumn, their meat preserved with layers of coarse salt or hung in smokehouses until it turned tough as leather. Fish, for those near rivers or the sea, was dried or pickled, with wealthier homes enjoying imported salted cod from the north. But milk and cheese, these were the real medieval winter treasures. Milk was difficult to store, so it was quickly turned into butter, curds, or hard cheeses, capable of lasting the entire season. And then there were the two unsung heroes of the medieval diet. Honey, not just a sweetener but a preservative and medicine, smeared over wounds, mixed into tonics, and used to extend the life of fruits and nuts. Alcohol, not just for pleasure, but for survival. Weak ale, often safer to drink than water, was a daily staple. Mead, cider, and diluted wine provided warmth, nourishment, and perhaps most importantly, a moment of comfort in an unforgiving winter. But even with the best preparations, hunger came. Chroniclers recorded chilling accounts of famine years, where the desperate resorted to eating boiled roots, tree bark, and even hay. In the worst cases, people dug up animal bones from old graves, grinding them into dust to mix with water and call it soup. There were even whispers of cannibalism, especially during the infamous Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when relentless cold and rain destroyed crops for 2 years straight. Yet, they endured, because to live in the Middle Ages was to understand one simple truth: winter never showed mercy. On the bright side, at least they didn't have to worry about New Year's resolutions to eat less bread. They'd already been forced into it. Imagine suffering from a high fever in the dead of winter. Your skin is slick with sweat, yet your body shivers violently under layers of blankets. Your breath rasps, your throat is raw, and your limbs feel like they're made of iron. Now imagine your doctor steps forward, holds up a knife, and declares, "We must let the sickness out." This was medieval medicine. Winter was a breeding ground for sickness. Damp, unheated homes, smoke-filled air, and close quarters turned simple colds into raging pneumonia, while malnutrition from lack of fresh food weakened immune systems. Tuberculosis, influenza, and fevers swept through villages, sometimes wiping out entire families. And then there was scurvy, a slow, creeping death that turned gums black, rotted teeth from the skull, and caused old wounds to reopen. Without access to fresh fruits or vegetables, the body simply began to shut down. Faced with illness, medieval people turned to a mixture of practical remedies, superstition, and outright madness. Some herbal treatments actually worked: garlic and honey for infections, thyme and nettle tea for fevers, fermented foods, like pickled cabbage, to prevent scurvy. But alongside these practical cures were more terrifying treatments: bloodletting, where doctors cut open veins to release the bad humors; suction cups, heated and placed on the skin to draw out illness; live animals as medicine, frogs pressed against boils, pigeon blood smeared on wounds, even a roasted mouse eaten whole as a cure for the common cold. Yet, through all this, faith remained the greatest medicine of all. Churches held mass prayers to ward off sickness, relics of saints were pressed against fevers, and holy water was sprinkled over the ill. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. In the depths of winter, the earth was frozen, food was scarce, and illness lurked in every household. And yet, if you stumbled into a medieval village on a feast day, you would find joy. Laughter echoed as children raced down snowy hills on wooden sleds. Music and dancing filled the halls of great manors. People drank, sang, and celebrated, not despite the winter, but because of it. Winter was an idle time. Every family had tasks to complete before spring: repairing plows, sharpening scythes, mending tools, because once the frost broke, the fields had to be ready. Weaving, sewing, and dyeing wool. Thick winter garments were made, not for luxury, but for survival. Training for war, nobles held winter tournaments, while soldiers practiced on frozen fields, knowing that spring meant new campaigns. But when the work was done, the people celebrated. The Feast of Fools, where peasants dressed as lords, and the world turned upside down for a day. Twelfth Night, where a bean hidden in a cake could crown a peasant the king of the feast. Ice jousting and snowball fights, because even in the harshest winters, play was part of life. Yet, beneath the laughter, fear remained. Medieval people believed winter was a time when spirits roamed freely, that the long nights allowed the dead to whisper in the wind. So they lit candles in their windows, hung charms above doorways, and whispered ancient prayers to keep the darkness at bay. Because in the medieval world, winter wasn't just a season, it was a battle between life and death.